He was a
You
mafia
have
king
1
who thought he
hour
could
to
buy
leave.
anything, starting with the city's oldest mansion. He told the invisible Maid she had an hour to pack her rags and get out, but he didn't realize the woman he was evicting was the one who signed his lease. Welcome to Korean Mafia Love Tales, your ultimate destination for gripping stories of the Korean Mafia, underworld power, and forbidden interracial romance. Dive into thrilling mafia tales filled with dangerous love, betrayal, obsession, and passion set in the dark and mysterious underworld. Our stories feature powerful Korean mafia bosses, strong female leads, and intense romantic connections that cross cultures and boundaries. If you love mafia romance, Korean drama vibes, billionaire love stories, and underworld tales, this channel is for you. Subscribe for weekly uploads of addictive mafia stories, Korean underworld romance, love tales, and dramatic storytelling that will keep you hooked till the end. If you want to see how this story of an eviction results, stay with me until the very end. And as we begin, hit that like button and tell me in the comments, what's an embarrassing moment you will never forget in your life? The tires of the armored black motorcade crunched over the pristine white gravel of the Blackwood estate like bone being ground to dust. As the lead sedan came to a halt before the towering limestone columns of the mansion, the air seemed to grow heavy, as if the house itself were bracing for an invasion. Kang Min-yi stepped out of the vehicle, his presence immediately anchoring the chaotic energy of the morning. He stood for a moment, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal suit, his gaze sweeping over the sprawling architecture with a cold, proprietary light. To the world, this was a historic landmark of old-money elegance, but to Min-yi, it was a tactical conquest, a fortress that would signal his transition from the blood-stained alleys of the docks to the high-stakes boardroom of the city's elite. The dragon tattoo on his neck pulsed subtly as he tilted his head, the dark ink a sharp contrast against the marble-white perfection of the estate. "It's a bit dusty, isn't it, boss?" Victor Hale's voice sliced through the silence, oily and eager. The property manager hurried to Min-yi's side, clutching a leather-bound portfolio as if it were a shield. "The previous owners let the standards slip, but don't worry, I've already begun the purification process." Min-yi didn't respond. He began to walk toward the massive oak doors, his steps deliberate and unhurried. Victor scrambled to keep up, his expensive loafers clicking frantically on the stone. "I've assembled the remaining staff in the foyer," Victor continued, his chest swelling with a borrowed sense of power. "Most of them are useless relics of the Bennett era. I'll have them cleared out by noon. We need fresh blood, people who understand the specific requirements of your organization." As they crossed the threshold, the interior of the mansion opened up into a cathedral of shadow and gold leaf. A small line of domestic workers stood by the grand staircase, their heads bowed, their faces masks of practiced neutrality. Victor stopped in front of them, his lip curling in a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Listen up," Victor barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "The era of the Bennetts is dead. You are looking at your new king. This mansion is now the headquarters of a global enterprise, and we have no room for sentimentality or slow feet." Min-yi's eyes traveled down the line, dismissive and bored, until they snagged on a figure at the very end. Amara stood in her simple, charcoal-colored uniform, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was the only one who didn't seem to be trembling. While the others looked at the floor in fear, she looked at the floor as if she were counting the molecules in the marble. "You," Victor snapped, pointing a manicured finger at Amara. "Why are you still in that uniform? Didn't I tell you to have your quarters emptied?" Amara didn't flinch. She simply shifted her gaze to Min-yi, her expression unreadable, her silence so profound it felt like a challenge. For a split second, the new king felt a flicker of something he couldn't name, a sudden, sharp intuition that he hadn't quite conquered as much as he thought he had. The scent of cedar oil and expensive floor wax usually dominated the mansion, but in the staff kitchen, it was replaced by the humble, grounding aroma of Earl Grey tea. Amara sat at the worn oak table, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug that had belonged to her grandmother. She was a silhouette of stillness in the morning light, a stark contrast to the storm that had just entered her home. The swinging double doors burst open with a violent thud, the brass hinges screaming in protest. Victor Hale marched in, his face flushed with the kind of frantic adrenaline that only comes to small men who have suddenly been given a large whip. He stopped short, his eyes raking over Amara's seated form with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Are you deaf or just remarkably stupid?" Victor's voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the quiet. He strode across the linoleum, his designer shoes clicking with an aggressive, uneven rhythm. "I gave an order in the foyer. That uniform doesn't make you a resident, it makes you a servant. And servants without a master are just squatters." Amara didn't move. She didn't even look up from her tea. "The tea is still hot, Mr. Hale," she said softly, her voice like velvet over gravel. "You look like you could use the calm." Victor let out a harsh, barking laugh, a sound of genuine disbelief. He reached down, his hand slamming onto the table close to her mug, vibrating the liquid within. "You think this is a game? You think because you've spent your life scrubbing the baseboards of this mausoleum that you have a right to the air here? Look at you." He gestured vaguely at her simple charcoal dress and her natural curls, pinned back with practical, utilitarian clips. "You are a relic of a dead family. You're a ghost haunting a house that's already been sold to a man who eats people like you for breakfast." He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over her, his breath smelling of expensive espresso and cold ambition. "Minyi doesn't like clutter. And right now, Bennett, you are the most unsightly piece of clutter in his new palace. I want you out. Not by tomorrow, not by the end of the week. By sunset, I want your trunk on the curb. If I find so much as a stray hair of yours in the staff quarters after 6, I'll have the boss's enforcers handle the removal personally. Do you understand, or do I need to use smaller words?" Amara finally lifted her gaze. Her deep brown eyes were steady, devoid of the fear Victor so desperately craved. She looked at him not as a subordinate looks at a master, but as a scientist looks at a specimen that is doomed to fail its own test. "I understand perfectly, Victor," she murmured, the use of his first name hitting him like a physical slap. "Sunset, I'll be sure the light is just right when everything changes." The heavy silence of the grand library was broken only by the rhythmic click of Kang Minyi's lighter. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the afternoon sun catching the sharp edge of his jaw and the dark, coiling dragon that seemed to pulse against his throat. He had heard Victor shouting from across the hall, a shrill desperation that bored him. Minyi didn't value noise, he valued results. When the door creaked open, he didn't turn. He knew the weight of the footsteps. They were light, deliberate, and entirely lacking the frantic shuffle of someone about to lose their world. Amara entered the room not like a servant being summoned to her execution, but like a woman returning to her sanctuary. "Victor tells me you're being difficult," Minyi said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried the threat of a falling blade. He finally turned, his cold, observant eyes raking over her simple uniform. "He says you refuse to accept that the locks are changing." Amara stopped a few feet from him. In the presence of a man who radiated violence, she remained a pool of perfectly still water. "The locks have already changed many times, Mr. Kang," she replied softly. "But the house remains. It has a way of rejecting those who don't understand its foundations." Minyi stepped into her personal space, his height designed to overwhelm, his shadow swallowing her whole. He reached out, the dragon tattoo on his hand visible as he traced the air inches from her face, a silent display of the power he could use to crush her. "I've taken cities, Amara. I've dismantled empires far older than this pile of stone. Do you truly think a maid with a teapot is going to stand in the way of my headquarters?" He expected a flinch. He expected her to beg for a severance check or a few more days to find a shelter. Instead, Amara tilted her head slightly, her deep brown eyes meeting his with an intensity that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "I'm not standing in your way, Mr. Kang," she murmured. "I'm simply wondering if you've truly looked at the ledger. This mansion requires more than just money to keep. It requires a specific kind of permission. Are you quite sure you can afford the maintenance of a house that was never meant for someone like you?" Minyi's hand froze. The arrogance in his chest flickered, replaced by a sudden, jarring sense of displacement. She wasn't looking at a monster. She was looking at a tenant who hadn't checked his credit. For the first time in his life, the dragon felt the cold sting of doubt, wondering if he was the one being scrutinized by a power he couldn't yet see. The following week at Blackwood Mansion was a masterclass in the art of the unseen. Amara moved through the sprawling corridors like a ghost inhabiting its own tomb, her charcoal uniform a shadow against the gilded wallpaper. To the men who now paced the halls with holstered sidearms and hushed, gravelly voices, she was no more significant than the antique clock she wound or the dust she swept from the mahogany banisters. They spoke freely in her presence, unaware that every whispered secret and every violent decree was being etched into a mind that had forgotten nothing. From the periphery, Amara watched the new ecosystem of the house take root. She saw Jun Park, Minyi's silent shadow, marking the dead zones in the security cameras, areas she knew like the back of her own hand. She watched the way Minyi sat in her father's study, his sharp eyes scanning maps of the city's underground veins, his dragon tattoo seemingly coiling tighter around his neck as the pressure of his illegitimate empire mounted. He was a man building a fortress out of stolen air, and the cracks were already beginning to show. But it was Victor Hale who provided the most pathetic display. No longer the fawning servant, Victor had bloomed into a petty tyrant in Minyi's presence. Amara watched through the cracked door of the pantry as Victor met with local suppliers in the service entrance, his voice hushed and hurried. He was skimmed off the top of Minyi's renovation budget, pocketing kickbacks while promising the boss premium materials. He was a vulture picking at the carcass of a lion's kill, confident that the lion was too busy looking at the horizon to notice the thief at his feet. Late one evening, Amara stood on the mezzanine, hidden by the heavy velvet drapes, as Minyi dealt with a subordinate who had lost a shipment at the docks. There was no shouting, no dramatic flair, only the cold, surgical sound of a heavy blow and the terrifyingly calm instructions Minyi gave to Jun to clean up the mess. The calculated violence was supposed to intimidate the house into submission, but as Amara watched Minyi wipe a microscopic speck of blood from his white cuff, she didn't feel fear. She felt a profound, weary clarity. Minyi looked up then, his gaze snapping to the mezzanine as if he could sense the weight of her observation. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked across the cavernous foyer. He looked like a king drowning in his own crown, and she looked like the water. She didn't flinch, didn't bow. She simply turned away to finish her duties, leaving the most dangerous man in the city wondering why, in a house he had supposedly conquered, he was the only one who felt like an intruder. The atmosphere in the grand library had soured from the scent of old leather to the sharp, acrid tang of impending violence. Kang Minyi sat behind the massive mahogany desk, his posture a study in lethal stillness, while a bank of monitors flickered with the frustrated red text of a rejected wire transfer. Across from him, a group of high-priced attorneys shifted in their seats, their foreheads slick with cold sweat. "Explain it to me again," Minyi murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the crystal decanter on the sideboard hum. "How does a shadow refuse 8 figures of clean capital?" "Mr. Kang, the escrow remains locked," the lead solicitor stammered, adjusting his glasses with trembling fingers. "The funds were returned within seconds. The beneficial owner of the Bennett Trust has declined the transaction. There was no counteroffer, just a formal rejection and a stay on the title transfer." Minyi's hand tightened around his glass until the knuckles turned white. He had spent months orchestrating this takeover, weaving a web of front companies to mask his syndicate's involvement. To have the door slammed in his face at the final threshold was more than a financial setback. It was a public humiliation in the eyes of his lieutenants. "It's her," a voice hissed from the corner. Victor Hale stepped forward. His face flushed with a mixture of terror and opportunistic spite. He pointed a shaking finger toward the doorway, where Amara stood silently, a silver tray of fresh water in her hands. "It's that girl. She's been a curse on this house since the day you arrived, boss. She's whispering in the ears of the remaining staff, dragging her feet, creating a spiritual rot in this estate. She's a distraction we can no longer afford." Minyi's gaze snapped to Amara. He watched the way she set the tray down, her movements fluid and rhythmic, entirely unbothered by the chaos erupting around her. The dragon on his neck seemed to burn. He stood up, the heavy chair screeching across the floorboards like a dying animal. "You," he said, rounding the desk until he was inches from her. The aura of the dragon was suffocating, a physical weight designed to break the will of anyone in its path. "Every time I move to claim what is mine, I find you standing in the shadow of it. Victor is right. You are a pebble in my shoe, Amara. Do you think your quiet defiance has reached the ears of the ghosts who still own this place? Do you think you're protecting them?" Amara finally looked up, her deep brown eyes as calm as a midnight sea. She didn't look at the furious man or the cowering lawyers. She looked at the desk, her father's desk, and then back to Minyi. "Money is a loud language, Mr. Kang," she whispered, her voice cutting through his rage like a cooling breeze. "But ownership is a silent one. Perhaps the reason the wire transfer failed isn't because the amount was too small, but because the hand offering it is still perceived as a thief. You can blame the maid for the noise, but you should really be looking at why the house refuses to let you in." Minyi roared, sweeping the crystal tray off the table in a violent arc of shattered glass. He wanted to crush her, to see her break, but as she stood amidst the shards without blinking, he realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't the distraction. She was the message. The rejection of the wire transfer had turned the mansion into a pressure cooker, and Victor Hale was finally beginning to whistle. His face was a bloated mask of purple rage, his carefully styled hair now damp and disheveled. To Victor, the maid was no longer just an eyesore. She was the physical embodiment of his impending failure. If the deal collapsed, Minyi wouldn't blame the banks. He would blame the man who had promised him a seamless transition. "I'm done with the riddles," Victor screamed, his voice cracking as he lunged toward Amara. She was standing near the grand staircase, a bundle of fresh linens in her arms. Victor didn't see a woman, he saw a scapegoat. He reached out, his fingers hooking like talons into the fabric of her charcoal uniform, intending to drag her toward the massive oak doors and hurl her into the gravel driveway. "You've poisoned this house long enough. You're leaving. Now." Amara didn't struggle. She didn't scream. As Victor hauled her forward, her heels skidded only inches across the marble before she planted her weight. The linens spilled from her arms, a white cascade of silk hitting the floor, but her expression remained terrifyingly vacant. She looked at Victor's hand on her shoulder with the detached curiosity of someone observing a stray insect. "Let go of me, Victor," she said. It wasn't a plea. It was a cold, clinical observation of a mistake he was about to regret. "Or what?" Victor sneered, his face inches from hers. "You're nothing. You're a squatter in a dead woman's clothes." He raised his other hand, palm open, intending to strike the composure right off her face, but his wrist was caught in a grip that felt like a band of freezing iron. Kang Minyi stood there, his presence radiating a coldness that made the humid afternoon air turn to ice. He didn't look at Victor. His dark, obsidian eyes were locked entirely on Amara. He had been watching from the mezzanine, expecting to see the moment her spirit finally broke. He had expected tears, or at least the reflexive flinch of a woman facing a blow. But Amara was as still as a statue in a graveyard. Even with Victor's hand bruising her skin, her pulse, visible at the base of her throat, was steady, rhythmic. "Boss, let me just toss her out," Victor panted, trying to pull his arm back. "She's the reason the paperwork is stalled. She's the jinx." "Let her go, Victor," Minyi whispered. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than Victor, screaming. Victor recoiled, stumbling back as Minyi released him. The property manager began to stammer an excuse, but Minyi silenced him with a single, sharp tilt of his head. The Mafia king stepped closer to Amara, his gaze searching her face for a single crack, a single glimmer of the servant he had tried to evict. "You aren't afraid," Minyi noted, his voice laced with a sudden, sharp suspicion. He realized then that he wasn't looking at a victim. He was looking at a hunter who had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the prey to walk into the trap. "Why aren't you afraid of us, Amara?" Amara reached down, calmly picking up a single white towel from the floor. She smoothed the fabric with her thumb, her deep brown eyes finally meeting his. "Because, Mr. Kang, it's very hard to be afraid of men who are standing on a floor that doesn't belong to them." The afternoon shadows lengthened across the marble floor of the foyer, stretching like bars of a cage as a fleet of black town cars pulled into the circular drive. The sound of heavy doors closing in unison echoed through the house, a sharp, rhythmic accompaniment to the tension thickening the air. Victor Hale, sensing an opportunity to finally redeem himself, straightened his tie and wiped the nervous sweat from his upper lip. Finally, Victor hissed, a smug, oily grin returning to his face. The Bennett Trust's legal counsel. It's about time they sent someone to clear out the debris. He turned to Minyi, nodding with frantic enthusiasm. Watch this, boss. Once these sharks serve the final notice, this girl will have no choice but to vanish into the gutter where she belongs. Kang Minyi remained silent, his arms crossed over his chest, his obsidian eyes fixed on the entrance. He watched as three figures in impeccably tailored charcoal suits entered the mansion. They moved with the cold, sterile confidence of men who didn't just practice law, but dictated it. The lead attorney, a silver-haired man with a gaze as sharp as a scalpel, carried a leather attaché case embossed with the Bennett family crest. Victor practically lunged forward to meet them, his hand outstretched in a fawning gesture. Gentlemen, thank God you're here. We've had a bit of a squatter issue. This girl has been impeding the transition and confusing the staff. If you could just present the formal eviction papers, so my client can finalize the... The silver-haired man didn't even blink as he bypassed Victor's hand, moving past the property manager as if he were a piece of low-grade furniture. He didn't look at the lawyers Minyi had hired, nor did he acknowledge the Mafia king standing in the center of his own supposed fortress. Instead, the entire legal team stopped in front of Amara. The silence that followed was deafening. Victor stood with his hand still hanging in the empty air, his mouth agape. Minyi's brow furrowed, the dragon on his neck seeming to tighten as the atmosphere in the room shifted on its axis. The three attorneys bowed in perfect unison, a deep, respectful salutation reserved only for the highest tier of authority. "Ms. Bennett," the lead attorney said, his voice resonant and clear, cutting through Victor's fatting bravado. "We apologize for the delay. The paperwork for the permanent injunction has been filed, and the accounts have been secured per your instructions. We were informed there was an issue with unauthorized visitors." Amara stood tall, the simple maid's uniform suddenly looking like a royal robe. She didn't look at Victor, whose face had drained of all color until it matched the white marble of the floors. She didn't look at the legal team. She looked directly at Minyi. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Amara murmured, her voice no longer a whisper, but a command. "The issue is currently being assessed. It seems some people have mistaken a guest invitation for a deed of sale." Minyi felt the ground beneath his bespoke boots begin to crumble. He looked at the bow, the crest, and the woman he had tried to break, and for the first time, the new king realized he was standing in a throne room that belonged entirely to the maid. The silence in the foyer was no longer heavy. It was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the breath from Victor Hale's lungs and turned Kang Minyi's calculated world into a house of cards. Amara didn't look at the lawyers, and she didn't look at the door. Her focus remained entirely on the man who had tried to buy her history with blood money. With a slow, deliberate grace, she reached for the knot of her white apron. The sound of the fabric loosening felt like a thunderclap in the stillness. She pulled the garment away, dropping the symbol of her invisibility onto the marble floor. Underneath, her simple charcoal dress no longer looked like a uniform. It looked like a shroud for Minyi's ambitions. From a small, hidden pocket near her heart, she withdrew a heavy gold signet ring, the Bennett family crest, a shield and a rising sun etched deep into the metal. She slipped it onto her finger, the gold catching the dying light of the afternoon sun. It was the only jewelry she wore, and it carried more weight than all of Minyi's heavy watches and silk suits combined. "You spent so much time looking at the dust on the floor, Mr. Kang, that you forgot to look at the foundations," Amara said, her voice echoing with a regal authority that froze the air. She stepped toward the mahogany desk where Minyi had played at being king. From the leather attaché case held by Mr. Sterling, she pulled a single, thick document. She didn't hand it to him. She fanned it out across the desk like a winning hand of cards. You didn't just fail to buy this house, she murmured, leaning over the desk so he could see the cold fire in her eyes. You failed to vet your own creditors. Over the last 6 months, through a series of shell corporations you thought were your allies, the Bennett Trust has been quietly purchasing your syndicate's high-interest debt. The docks, the shipping lanes, the very warehouses where you store your merchandise, they all sit on land owned by me. Minyi's gaze dropped to the papers. His eyes darted across the figures, the signatures, and the corporate seals. The color didn't just leave his face, it seemed to drain from his very soul. The dragon on his neck appeared to wither as he realized the truth. He hadn't moved into this mansion to expand his empire. He had walked straight into a cage that had been being built around him since the moment he set foot on the gravel drive. I didn't stay here because I had nowhere else to go, Amara whispered, her voice a lethal caress. I stayed to see if the man who wanted to rule my city was worth the air he breathed. You aren't a king, Minyi. You're just a tenant who is very, very late on his rent. The silence that followed Amara's revelation was more absolute than the grave. Victor Hale was the first to break, his voice a frantic, high-pitched warble as he scrambled toward the desk. Boss, I had no idea. The vetting process was handled by the offshore teams. I was just trying to secure your legacy. Amara didn't even look at him. She merely raised a single hand, and the lead attorney, Mr. Sterling, stepped forward with a crisp blue folder. Mr. Hale, Sterling said, his voice dripping with professional disdain. We have documented every kickback, every inflated invoice, and every cent you've skimmed from the Bennett Trust's maintenance funds over the last 3 years. Your employment is terminated for cause, effective 10 seconds ago. You can't do this, Victor shrieked, looking to Minyi for a protection that was no longer there. Jun, Minyi said. It was the first time he had spoken since the unmasking. His voice was hollow, stripped of its predatory edge. He didn't look at his enforcer. He kept his eyes locked on Amara's signet ring. Jun Park moved with the silent efficiency of a shadow. He didn't use a weapon. He simply gripped Victor by the collar of his expensive, fraudulent suit and dragged him toward the door. Victor's protests faded into pathetic wails as he was hauled across the marble he had so recently claimed to own, until the heavy oak doors thudded shut, sealing him out of the world he had tried to steal. Now only the dragon and the heiress remained in the center of the library. Minyi stood slowly, his tall frame usually so intimidating, but now he seemed like a man realizing the floorboards were made of glass. He looked at his hands, hands that had built an empire on violence, and then at Amara, who had built hers on patience. I thought I was the one taking over, Minyi murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It wasn't a smile of victory, but of bitter, newfound respect. I came here to find a throne. I didn't realize I was walking into a classroom. Amara stepped closer, her deep brown eyes steady and regal. She didn't look at him with hatred. She looked at him with the cold clarity of a sovereign. You are a guest in this house, Minyi. Not because of your money and certainly not because of your ink. You are here because I allowed it. I wanted to see if the dragon was a leader or just another scavenger like Victor. She leaned against the mahogany desk, the Bennett ring gleaming. So here are my terms. You can take your men and your bruised pride and leave this estate tonight. I will call in your debts, dismantle your shipping lanes, and watch your empire vanish by morning. Or, she paused, her voice dropping to a low, commanding vibration, you can stay. You can keep your seat at this desk, but you will move only when I say. You will learn that real power isn't about who you can kill, it's about who you can protect. Choose, Minyi. Do you want to be a ghost, or do you want to learn how to be a king? Minyi looked at the coiling dragon on his reflection in the window, then back to the woman who held his life in her hands. Slowly, deliberately, the most dangerous man in the city lowered his head in a bow that was finally, irrevocably, sincere. Here comes the end of the story. If the story hits you, click a like button, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and drop the comment below.